This semester, we've been talking about demand for all goods and services. So now we're going to formally define that. We're looking at aggregate demand. So we need to figure out where aggregate demand comes from. And that's what we're looking at in this level. How do you get aggregate demand? When we plot aggregate demand, we know it's downward sloping. And aggregate demand just means the total for the demand in the economy. So aggregate just means the sum or the total. But let's figure out why aggregate demand is downward sloping and who demands goods and services in the economy. So we're going to start by looking at aggregate expenditures. Aggregate expenditures, again, aggregate just means total or sum, and expenditures, we're just talking about the spending in the economy. So then we have to think back to our expenditure approach to calculating gross domestic product. So we're looking at who is doing the spending in the economy. And you'll recall the expenditure approach to gross domestic product is C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. And it's really based on who's doing the spending in the economy. So we have households, we have businesses, we have government, and we have people in other countries. And then we have to subtract away the fact that the households and businesses and government sometimes buy goods that aren't made here. So we have to subtract away the imports. Now, for this, we're going to use AE to represent aggregate expenditures. And then we're also going to be looking at national income. And you'll recall the income approach to calculating gross domestic product is the total of our wages, our interest, our rent, and our profits. So we're going to denote national income here with a Y. And so we're going to compare our income and our aggregate expenditures, and we're going to look at what happens, what causes that spending to change. When we look at our spending, we can break it into two parts. We can break our spending into autonomous spending and induced. Autonomous spending is spending that we do regardless of our income level. So essentially, autonomous spending is the money you would spend even if your income was zero. Whereas induced spending is spending that we do that depends on our level of income. So if our income increases, do we spend more? That's the induced spending. It's dependent on the level of income. Autonomous spending is spending we do even if our income is zero. So for example, imagine that you're in The Walking Dead or some kind of zombie apocalypse. You're fleeing from disaster. Well, if we're fleeing from some kind of disaster, then we're not making things. No new goods are being produced. No one's making any income. Okay, income, output, all zero. But we still have goods and things that we need to survive. Right? If you think about The Walking Dead, they aren't if you go back to the original, some of the first seasons, right? They're not opening a business. There's no one making goods and services. They are instead drawing down on the current inventory, right? They're raiding houses and finding chocolate pudding. So they're drawing down on the already existing inventory. And this is essentially when we talk about autonomous spending, even if our income is zero, we still have to live. So we would be getting goods that already existed, that are not being made, and we'd still need those goods, right? Even if you had no income, if you were laid off, you still need food, shelter, basic necessities. And that's what this autonomous spending is. So to help us kind of understand autonomous spending and induced spending and figure out how we get to aggregate demand, let's work through an example. So we're going to work through this imaginary economy here, and here's the data for the economy. So we have national income here on the left, and we have our net taxes. How do you find net taxes? Taxes minus transfer payments. And then we have savings and consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and our net exports. And then here on the far right column, we have aggregate expenditures, total spending in the economy. So we're going to be looking at each of these and diving into what they tell us. But first, let's focus on our national income and our aggregate expenditures. Okay, so when the economy is in equilibrium, when it's not growing or shrinking, our income is equal to our spending. So if you think back to that circular flow diagram, the income we make, we use to buy goods and services. So that's equal to our spending. That spending is then going to businesses to make goods and services, which they pay us for our land, our labor, our capital, for all those resources they use to make those goods and services, puts income in our pocket and allows us to spend. So it's that circular flow and being in equilibrium, not growing or shrinking, when aggregate expenditures equal national income. So if we look at this scenario here, when is this economy in equilibrium? Okay, so let's find where income is equal to aggregate expenditures. So notice as you go down the list here, we'll notice that when income is 600, aggregate expenditures are 600. So this economy is in equilibrium when income and aggregate expenditures are 600. When income is not 600, notice that when income is less than 600, then what we see is that our aggregate expenditures are more than our income. And as our income increases and goes past the income of 600, then notice now our income is more than our spending. So we need to figure out where the economy is in equilibrium, and then we're going to look at how that equilibrium changes when you start to change consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and so on. Now, one more thing when we look at this table, and that is autonomous versus induced. So how much autonomous spending is there in this economy? Remember, autonomous spending is spending we do that does not depend on income. So notice here, when our income is 0, our aggregate expenditures are 300. So even when we have 0 income, collectively, we are still spending $300 on goods and services. So what that tells us is for our aggregate expenditure function, the autonomous spending is 300, and now we need to figure out how much induced spending we have. And induced spending is going to be a function of income. So we're going to use Y as a placeholder here, and then we're going to find essentially the slope of a graph when we graph aggregate expenditures, or we're looking at how the aggregate expenditures change as income changes. And so once we get that number, then we can sub in numbers for Y, for the income level, to find aggregate expenditures.